Hello and welcome to another Caldwell conversation where we share a member of the Caldwell community with you, our viewers. I'm Dave Walters and I'm joined today by Joy Johnson. Joy is one of our grammar school teachers and she's been here at Caldwell since 2012. Now, Joy, you did not start your career in what I would call a traditional teacher's fashion. You actually served in the U.S. Air Force in the build-up to Desert Storm. Thank you for your service. And explain to us how exactly you ended up teaching at Caldwell.
Well, I have three children. My oldest daughter is 34, and when she was a preschooler, we were in a community of young parents at our church who were just looking for something different for education. Some of the families had already been homeschooling, and so I was watching them and in some ways being mentored by them. They were a little older than we were at the time. And one day one of them put this book in our hands, a book that had been written in the early 80s. At this time it was the early 90s, and the book's called Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, written by Douglas Wilson. And I would say that certainly Douglas Wilson and his book were a large factor in launching the classical Christian school movement. And so all my friends said is read this book. And about 5 or 6 families in our church read this book. And to make a long story short, we actually launched a classical school out of our Baptist church in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. That school now is larger than Caldwell Academy, and it's been a roaring success. But that's actually where I started with my oldest children.
Okay. Now, you had any number of educational options, and yet there was something about this book, something about the experience you had that was compelling about the classical Christian model. What was that for you?
Well, I would say first of all it was the Christian model, and my husband and I were very intent on wanting that model for our children. The classical part was something we came upon and learned more about with this book. And we did what so many other parents have done, and that is we recognized something unique, something different, and yet something very familiar. Myself having been schooled in the 60s for my younger years, and we were hungry for that.
You've had your son to graduate from Caldwell,
yes,
and you shared you've had other students, other children who've come through and experienced this classical education. Can you describe how that has shaped these young people, how the classical education has shaped your son and the other students you've taught?
Sure, I will. One thing that I was able to really notice, I have a 10-year gap between my second child and my third. My older daughters, after we moved away from the classical school we helped start, ended up completing their education in public schools in North Carolina. And I don't mean in any way to demean the public schools, but I will tell you, it put me in a unique position to compare and contrast the two. So when my son was born so many years later, there actually was a classical school he could go to. So my son has been in classical education from kindergarten. As you say, he graduated from Caldwell. I see there's so much difference in what's offered on the different plates. What is offered on the plate of learning at public schools in North Carolina is very, very different from what's offered at classical schools. You can compare curricula and it will show up very, very clearly. And I will say that one thing that stands out to me, if I were to sum it up in a few words, I would say that the excitement about what one is learning radiates out of my students. And they literally will come into classrooms in the morning and they'll say, "Are we doing history this morning, Mrs. Johnson?" Or "Are we going to get to do science today?" Or "Are we going to get to do Bible today?" Literally, they will say, "Are we going to get to do?" And some people may think that Bible is boring or history is boring, but the way it is taught in classical schools, in the way that it builds on each other, the children learn it chronologically. They are sitting on the edge of their seats and they are so excited. They're able to make connections across different subjects that all relate together. We are not teaching them in history as separate ponds of information in different parts of the years. We're teaching it like a river. and they know that one part of it upstream affects what happens downstream. And it excites them, it excites the teacher.
Yes, that's plain to see. Thank you so much, again, for your service, and also for your service to the Caldwell community and the many students who you've inspired through the classical education model.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you too for joining us, and we invite you to learn more about Caldwell Academy, perhaps sign up for an open house, and learn more of the admissions process on our website at caldwellacademy.org. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks for your interest in Caldwell Academy.